All right. When it comes to slump and drape molds, a couple things to know. If you use a bowl and the slab of clay goes inside, that's called a slump mold. If it goes on the outside, that's called the drape mold. So slump mold, drape mold, depending on how you position the clay. If you use something like this, the slab of clay is going to go onto the inside, and that is going to be used as a slump mold. So that's kind of just, that's how that one works. Now, what if you didn't want a circle? You could actually take coils of clay, right? Just make a coil of clay in whatever shape you want. You could put it in a heart shape, and then you could use that as a slump mold, and the slab of clay goes on the inside. And something to note about that, I'll just kind of do a quick example here. When you position your slab of clay into your slump mold, if you're using this styrofoam or you're using the coil method, remember clay sticks to clay, right? So if I had a coil of clay and I'm using that as my mold, and that's going to stick. So what you'd want to do is take your coils, which you've created into a mold, cover it with paper towels, then you can put your slab over it and it won't stick. Now, obviously the clay isn't going to stick to the styrofoam, so that would work. And once you get it positioned in the way that you want, if you drop it, it'll fill that mold a little bit better. And then you can use your needle tool and you can cut it to the exact shape you want. So that's just a pretty easy way to make a shallow dish using something like this or something you might have around your house. Or like I said, you can just take coils of clay and use that. And it's just going to create a nice shallow mold. So that is sort of a slump mold style in making your own with coils or using that styrofoam. And then the rest are going to involve, these bowls. So one thing I'm realizing that I don't have that I need is a small, slightly damp sponge. Let me go grab that. All right, I've got my sponge, and now it's time to investigate these different molds. Here is really important information to know. Something like this, that has tough angles. So watch what happens. When I put my slab of clay on this, if I want to fit it perfectly, eventually I'm going to get that excess that you can see there. And that there's just no way to really not have that. So you have to live with it, and that's part of your thing. Or, and this becomes very complicated, you need to slice like a little wedge-shaped pizza slice out, and then you've got to do a slipping and scoring method here, which I'll show you how to slip and score in a different video if you haven't seen that already. And you've got to carefully fuse this back together. It's almost like giving a facelift. You've taken out the excess, and now you're kind of pulling it back together nice and tight. So that's one way to do it. However, we only have access to the outside right now. So eventually, when this comes off of this mold, you're going to have this seam on the inside, which needs to be addressed. And it creates just a lot of problems. So if I was you, I would not use something that has sharper angles. A gentle sloping bowl really works best for this. So this is not something that I would pick. It's possible to use, it's just not something that I would pick. So something like this, you can see this is not a gentle sloping bowl, that's pretty aggressive. So if we use this, I've got my clay on there, you can see as I'm starting to fit it, what happens again? I've got excess clay. So one thing that you can do is if you trim it, and you actually don't need a lot of this, if I'm only making a shallow thing, that excess really isn't an issue. You can see as I just try to spin it and fit it tighter, the excess is not an issue if you just don't have a lot of clay. So all I'm going to get is, it's not going to be that deep of a bowl. Pull it off so you can kind of see it's kind of just a shallow bowl. That's what I would have if I use something that's steeper like this. Now, another really important thing to know is that if I do use something that's metal or plastic or ceramic, the clay sticks to it. And I need that clay to stay on that mold for a while until it becomes leather hard and is sort of stiff enough to support its own weight. So what you must do is put down a paper towel to create a barrier, then go ahead and put your clay on there. And now when it's time and this is drier and stiffened up, I can take this off with no issues. If you forget, it's stuck on here and we basically have to peel it off and you have to start over, which definitely is not what you want. So make sure that you are aware of that. Something like this, I think this actually would work pretty good as long as your slab is going to about here. This is gentle sloping. It becomes more aggressive right here. If you wanted to do the entire thing, obviously you're going to need to roll a very big slab, which involves a lot more work. And so if you think more of just like a gentle sloping dish or a shallow bowl and slightly on the smaller side, this assignment becomes much easier to do. So that could be something to know. Now something like this has like a sharp angle right there. And when my clay goes on here, it's going to pick that up on the inside of my dish. So if I don't want that, I'm going to have to do a lot of work smoothing it out later on. Or what I could do, I could take clay right now and kind of pack it here all the way around. I would use my paper towel barrier, and then I can take my slab of clay and I can position it, and that's not something that I would have to deal with. All right. So these are all just precautions and things to know about. And when it comes to the most likely scenario for this, these styrofoam, basically unused meat trays work really good for this. The clay does not stick to this material, so you don't need to use the paper towel. It's a shallow sort of dish, so it's going to work really well. Again, if I use it this way, slump mold. If I use it this way, drape mold. Now, these are going to work pretty well. Something like this, it can work, but that's going to be an issue. That's going to be something that you're just going to have to accept. That's going to be part of your project if you use this. Something like this can also work, but make sure you cut the clay here and not have it be coming down, because this edge right here will affect that. So let me show you how to get a slab of clay. I'll use this one as a drape mold and this one as a slump mold, so you can kind of see the easiest scenario here. All right, so I've got my slab of clay, and this is just kind of fitting very nicely right now, which is sort of unusual. Normally you'd have a little excess to trim away. So what I'm going to do is take my slightly damp sponge, and what you want is the sponge to not, if you squeeze it, I've got a couple drops coming out, but that's it. That's all the moisture you want. And you just kind of take your slab of clay and you fit it into the mold like that. And you can see that's just going to create a nice a very shallow dish. Now, if this is just sort of not what I want, I can maybe find something. I could maybe use this, right? So get rid of that. I'll bring this in. Now I've got excess clay that I'm going to need to trim away. So what I like to do here is pull up the edge, kind of lightly start getting that clay going into the mold. Again, this is the slump technique, right? And I know that I'm not going to need all of this clay on the outside, so let me just start trimming it down. And when you start trimming it down, the clay will fit into your mold better. So I've done that, and I'll kind of do another pass, pressing down lightly, not to stress this slab out at all. Trim a little bit more. Again, lifting a little, pressing down, and you can see it's starting to take shape here and becoming a nice form in my mold. Now, once I've got it in there, I could, of course, I might need to use a knife tool at this point, and I would cut very carefully. And now my clay is in the slump mold, and all I have to do is wait for this to become leather hard, and I can take it out. Now, on this slump drape assignment, there's a requirement where you need to add handles and you need to add a foot to your piece. And obviously, right now I have no access to the bottom. It's inside, so I can't add the foot. If my handles are going to be attached like this, I could potentially add my handles now. It's always better to add clay when it's the same moisture level. So the sooner I can add the handles, the better. The sooner I can add the foot, the better. Unfortunately, I can't add the foot until this comes off. So that's just something to keep in mind. But if you can add the handles, you should do it at this point. So that's the slump method. And then now if I'm going to use this for the drape method, I've got my slab, I've got my mold, place it on the thing, start to kind of bring it down. And although this is just a demo, and I was rushing a little, you can see the tension cracks that are starting to develop on this. And that crack right there, that's kind of an issue. That could become a problem later on. So probably right now, if this was my real project, I would want to maybe get that blue rib tool. And I got my slightly damp sponge, and I have my fingers. And I'm going to kind of try to repair this by just pulling over the clay a little more aggressively. Same thing over these cracks. Cracks will just become bigger if you don't address them when they happen. And with slabs, a crack can basically ruin the entire piece because it can break it in half pretty easily. So I've done that. Continue to fit this. Now I know I don't want these edges like that, so I'll trim some of that excess off. And anytime you trim off the excess, all that happens is it fits the mold better. I can use my damp sponge to kind of fit it a little bit better as well. And what you'd want to check for really is evenness, right? So this was just a demonstration. It's not that precise. It's like, do I really want it to be here and then kind of like coming down here? That if I wanted it to be the same height all the way around, then I would have to trim this much more precisely. Obviously, I'd be taking some off of here. And that doesn't look like a clean edge. Craftsmanship-wise, that's not what you'd want to do. So really, I would have to carefully kind of maybe measure, eyeball, maybe trimming it. So that it's going to be a little more precise, something like that. Now, this is sitting on this drape mold. What do I have access to now? I have access to the bottom, so I definitely can put my foot on. And when you make a foot, sometimes people like to do something like this, like that, right? That could be a little wobbly. The best, most ideal foot that you can generally make, remember the foot is the base upon which a pot rests. The most successful ones that I see, really, and I'm just doing this one quickly again, but if you create like a little circle, a little oval, a little ring, and you attach that, that generally works pretty good. Or you can do something like that. That typically will work pretty well as well. What does not work that great, which people always want to do, is these round balls they'll put on. And if you do 4, which people often want to do, and one of them is just a little taller, a little shorter than the others, your dish is going to wobble. If you do 3, that will cut down on the wobble. However, the connection point of a round form to a flat form is not great. There's just a little bit of a connection area there, and they can come off pretty easily if you're not careful. So be aware of that. So I could add my foot now. I could add my handles now. I could do a lot at this point. And once that's done, you just let it sit. It needs a few hours probably on this mold, maybe even more than a few hours. And eventually when it is stiff enough to not lose its form, which obviously it isn't now, I can just lay this flat again. But when you feel it and it's just kind of stiff enough that it doesn't have necessarily that wobble to it, then it's time to carefully take it off of the mold, and then you're putting finishing touches on it, and your form is basically complete. So using the mold technique, once everything is set up and on there, your form is built pretty quickly. It's a slab, it's on the mold, it's craftsmanship of just getting it to fit the mold and adding anything else you're going to add, and then your form is essentially built. And at that point, it's just about getting it off carefully and the final craftsmanship touches. So that's how you do a slump in a drape mold.